We are back and we have a bit to talk about. We released beta 8. So it's been a couple of weeks. We've been chugging along and we have a relatively minor release, which actually, if you look at the changelogs, there's quite a few things in there. And we'll touch on a couple of those. But really, nothing that couldn't have been in V1, like a minor point release. Essentially, we have not made any changes to the declarative attribute API. We improved some things. We added some niceties. We cleaned up the Datastar, what was previously a singleton class. We'll go into a bit of those. All in all, we lost 200 bytes as well. So it's kind of nice to see how the file size is fluctuating. And it's not necessarily getting bigger or getting smaller. It's just kind of bouncing around. So it's kind of feels like we're in a sweet spot here.
Yeah, no, it's been pretty exciting. The other one is the Idiomorph 7.02 came out, which does add a bunch of. The irony is that they broke some things earlier, and then they, ironically, in the same vein, said, "Hey, we can actually fix those and not change the API," because they thought they couldn't change the API. So, long story short, they went back and fixed things. So I had a bunch of things to put things in the right condition for Idiomorph to work, and then I was able to get rid of those. So a lot of it was adding a bunch of stuff to make sure the newest version of Idiomorph worked, and then getting rid of it. So it's just been one of those kinds of times, and the cleanup stuff is good, but we're getting to the point where I don't know what else we can clean up. Like, I really am pretty happy with where things are at.
Yeah, I feel like we have continually, during the beta phase, we've been continually tweaking and optimizing the core, the engine. We've made some further optimizations that we're going to go into a bit more detail about today as well. But that's a good point. We patched something in Idiomorph, and then Idiomorph released an update. We were able to remove that patch, so that brought the file size down. And I believe Idiomorph 0.8 is underway in terms of development. Oh, and to mention, you actually had a really interesting conversation with Micah, who is currently maintaining that, so people should go listen to that. And in the previous podcast, I talked to Lazarus of HX Pod. We talked about PHP stuff. So it's been a while since you and I have sat down and recorded one of these together.
Yeah, no, it's been kind of weird. In fact, there was a week ago, I was like, "Hey, are you okay? Are you alive?" Because we would go from like talking every 15 minutes, it felt like, to like every 15 hours, and it'll soon be every 15 days, and then every 15 weeks. Because yeah, my ability to help the project is slowly starting to atrophy. Like, now we're in the mode where people need to start writing blogs and doing videos and doing external stuff, because I'm not a streamer kind of guy. Like, I'll go on and, like, go talk to anybody, but yeah, that's just not the things that I'm good at. So I'm excited because this is like finally where I get to just use the tool. Like, so I'm excited for that. But yeah, it's there's still a lot to do. We do still need help, but it's more in the ancillary stuff. And in fact, I think you were going to talk a little bit about that for what V1 means, because to me, I literally don't have anything on my list now that I will change other than possibly Idiomorph. And that's me and Micah and maybe the other team. And either we make changes to Idiomorph, or we end up forking it and we going down some of the crazy roads that I'm thinking about taking it. So, but that can all be the nice part about doing the whole declarative semantic versioning is even changing out all of Idiomorph and how we do morphing and doing like these crazy Merkle trees and stuff that I want to do. That's a patch release. That's not even a new version. Like, just because the morph target is still the same. You'll still have the same semantics. So I'm really excited by that, because it means that we can do some interesting things without breaking anybody.
Yeah, those are purely internal changes that don't affect the external API whatsoever. Yeah. So another thing that I wanted to touch on is adding these niceties around input values. I know you were like, that doesn't sound so interesting, but I think it's
like this comes from people doing CMS and PHP type stuff, and that's like where my eyes glaze over. I'm like, yeah, like, you need those things, but luckily most of the things I do don't do those things. Like, I actively try to avoid those situations. So I know they're needed, so I'm actually excited. Like, I want to know more about them. I looked at the code and went, yeah, that seems correct, and then that's it. Like,
Yeah, so we tried to stay as close to the HTML spec as possible, or be completely spec compliant. HTML has some strangeness when it comes to how, forms are submitted and what it does with the input fields. One of those is that when you have a checkbox field, or when you have multiple checkbox fields and you give them the same name, it doesn't just send off one, it'll send them all off as an array. And this might make sense, but it's kind of strange because when you have a single checkbox, it's just one string that gets sent off. When it's multiple, it's an array. And a checkbox really should be kind of a Boolean because it should be true or
One would
false.
think.
Is it on or off? So we're in kind of a difficult situation there because we're working with signals. And when you bind a checkbox input field to a signal, there's that two-way binding. So originally, or even still now, if a signal is defined, then any input field or text area field or select field is going to inherit the value of the signal because the signal takes preference, right? This is part of how the Datastar library works. However, because you don't have to define a signal before you bind an input field using data bind, we've made it now so, and this is the nicety, so that if you have a value defined on the element, the signal will inherit that value. It kind of means that when you're setting up your input fields, you can put a value in. I think that's good also for progressive enhancement, although I know we don't really care too much about that or place too much weight on it. But there's just one place to put that text. You don't have to be sure to move that into a signal or perhaps even duplicate it. You can put it in one place. That applies to all input fields and all fields really or elements that can take a value. And the checkbox stuff is now we kind of adhere to how HTML works. So if you predefine your signal as an array, and you have multiple checkboxes with the same name, we're going to match that behavior and we're going to set the signal to an array of the values of the checkboxes. That's kind of what it comes down to.
No, it seems like a very valid thing. It's good that people are hitting it. In fact, that's why it's so great to have a wider community now of backend developers because everyone has different things that they are caring about. And in fact, one of the ones that came up is the closure guys, who are always the kind of the crazy out there people, the little Jedis. They're working on doing all these crazy things around their gzip stuff and building it directly into the format and testing out what that can do. And not more of a metrics based style of saying, hey, when does it make sense to, if you can gzip, one thing just for people to be aware, the only issue with zipping things or doing Z standard or broadly is that if your message size is too small, it'll look like it's hanging, and that can be bad. So you have to be able to be a little bit knowledgeable about timeouts and when to chunk things and all that. So there's a little bit of gotchas around there, but they're trying to make it something that's just built in natively into the SDK for them. And I like, that's amazing. Like I want that. So it's good to see the community of developers all expanding around the ideas, because as soon as they figure out like the right set of like, here's what you have to do, I'm going to steal that and put it into the Go side 100%. In fact, speaking of the rest of the community, you had an interesting talk with Lazarus from the HX pod space. Yeah, how was that? Like, because you guys are, in some ways, it seemed like you're talking the same world of PHP, and yet not. Like, it was a kind of an interesting conversation of like where that line is, and it was interesting because Go devs tend to be on kind of the same page a little bit more, whereas it seems in PHP land there is more, like a different styles of thinking about the problem.
Yes. The thing that I discovered, or that we discovered during that, is that Datastar is doing so little, right? So just to give context here, Lazarus put together for his first Datastar test a demo where you have kind of a live chat, and you can not only chat together, but you can see as the other person is typing. So very much a long-lived connection where you're sending up very frequently and you're streaming back down. And that is, as we discussed on that episode, like a use case where you're stretching PHP in some sense,
Right.
because, but at the same time, like it's incredible how little Datastar code there goes into that, right? It's essentially for receiving and for streaming it back down, it's a single data on load attribute. And for sending it up, it's a data on whatever you want to click or key down or input. So then the problem shifts to the back end, which is what I like because I like working on the back end. And so Lazarus and I were, I would say, talking mostly about PHP and, working with the back end and what kind of store do you choose? He chose SQLite. I was a little bit critical of the way that he has structured that because I think for scaling up, you would want a proper pub sub system. But the timing was good because it was, I think, possibly after I'm not sure if it was 1 or 2 episodes after we talked about pub sub and Nats and Redis and all the possibilities. So we went into those. What was great was that it turned into a discussion about backend stuff, but solving backend problems for this situation where you have the possibility to stream things back down. And for me, that really shows how Datastar is kind of this conduit between backend and frontend that allows you to just almost make that connection transparent.
Yeah, I mean, the overall goal is to be the bare minimum, the dumbest thing you can possibly do, and yet be the full, complete solution. So the places where I think Carson's gotten a lot of things right is like make a simple thing that just does a thing. The problem is it doesn't do enough things. Like that's the only issue I have with it is that it doesn't do all the things I need to do to get my work done, kind of thing. So, like, yeah, we strive to be really small, and part of that, again, there's vanity metrics, but there's also like if you're that small, most likely you're doing something right. Like if that's all you need to do all these crazy things, like it is kind of interesting that his first try at basically a hello world would be impossible in anything like any of these other things that he was doing with HTMX. And he said that like it's not that that's a dig on HTMX. It's just like it's just not meant to do this kind of work. I really kind of wonder now that he's done that, like just do a normal app and just see how little, like it's even less than what he did. Like he didn't write that much. Datastar, there's like 6 or 7 lines of Datastar in most of it.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, but if you just wrote a normal app, it'd be 1 or 2 lines. So it is kind of interesting to see the vibe of people of like, well, I'll pull for a real-time app. And I'm like, okay, just because it can do that doesn't mean you have to do that. Like it's actually the easiest option in even the simple case, I think.
Right. Well, I put Lazarus on the spot about that.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
he did. He said, well, anyone can listen to this, but he basically said, he wanted to build some sort of demo that he knew he could not build with HTML.
Right.
And I think he made his point. But yes, of course, you could take whatever you build with HTMX and just do the same with Datastar. And I guess that would have been too uninteresting for Lazarus. So I don't know. I think it's kind of cool that he went for that.
Oh, I love that he did it. It's funny that the idea of a hello world or like a small project in Datastar in most projects would be a nightmare, right? Like that's the interesting thing is that people always we have people in the community that are literally making these like multi-way REPLs with live code, changing in production with like UIs that are animating and all that. And they're like, yeah, this is my like 16-line thing in Datastar. Like, okay, that like, yeah, but people are like, yeah, but can it do regular apps too? Like, yes, it can do those, of course. It's just funny that like people always gravitate to that thing because it's so easy. It doesn't seem like it's that hard. Like there's a little bit of setup, so you're not just sending like an HTML fragment. But after that, like I think it's just so much easier. It's such a flat line of my hello world to like I have real time stuff. There's no line. It's a straight line.
You open that connection if you're doing the long lived connection. You open that connection. That's open. That maintains
or not, right? Or don't do it.
Yeah,
like that's the whole point is that you can go either way.
The other thing that I mentioned last time we spoke, and it was a priority for me before we get to V1, is having a proper testing framework in place. We got that done. We've added at least 30 unit tests in addition to the tests that we already had set up connected to the examples, but all of these are now running properly in CI. So we've also set up, I don't know if I even mentioned this to you, that PRs cannot even be merged until the tests are passing.
Oh, that's awesome.
The problem we had before is that a lot of our tests were not passing, not because things were broken, but because the setup was flaky. But now they're passing when things are correct and they're failing when things are not correct. So that's set up, and that was really good for me to have that foundational thing working so that we can just build on that. And now anytime anybody reports a bug, It's like, okay, let me first go create a failing test and see if it is a bug, and then do red-green development. So make it pass and then apply the fix.
Yeah. No, it's really great. And it's one of those things that are long term. It opens up the doors to, if someone wants a feature, you say, okay, then write the test first, right? Like, let's see where it's at and make sure it doesn't break anything else.
Yeah. And at the moment, it's you and I writing those tests, or
Right.
people who understand a little bit more of how the framework is structured. But yeah, eventually that would be a great goal to have. So in terms of what is left until V1, you said we're getting back to boring. I think yeah, that when the tool is kind of this far along, everything else is ancillary. It's all going to be, explaining things better or creating these how-to guides, building up the testing framework. There aren't any features. I mean, we said this last time too, and we added a few features, but minor ones. But there's nothing that you and I think is missing, correct? We're
Yeah.
just...
The thing that kind of changed for me, at least, like, because you were like dealing with little bugs or like things that were happening, but one thing that kept coming up over and over again is we have, again, JavaScript is JavaScript, man. It's such a beast. But part of that is that we were getting things that were applying multiple times. So one of the things when you get in a plugin in Datastar, basically we look for the contents of the data-star, the key and the value, and then we parse those out, and then we take that contents and then we apply it to the plugin or whichever plugin that it's associated with. The problem is that we were calling apply multiple times. In the past, we did a big giant update of just delete everything and update everything, but that causes issues with set timeouts and all kinds of other things. That was done, so we replaced that. But we still had this issue where things kept applying multiple times. And I don't know, like, I'm just a bad developer. Like, I feel like I should be better at this age, or like have a clearer vision of what everything should be. Like, I should know it in my head before I sit down. But I don't know why I didn't think about this before. But literally all data-star attributes is just a string and a string, right? Like, they're just a strings. They're just two strings.
Well,
So
it's there's a key and a value. So it's data star, and the star part is the key, and then the value is what's in the double quotes.
yeah, I mean, that's all we have to go on, like, from the HTML spec side of things. But um, the thing is, we have all the information we need to not apply multiple times. Like, it's so dumb. And here's why I'm saying I'm dumb, because I'm already doing this in other places. So if you don't to put a ID on an element and it has a data-star, blah, 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 I still need to track those things. It still needs an ID internally for us to do stuff. So what I have been doing is I basically, and by the way, this might go into Idiomorph as like the way that they do things internally, is I look at the topographical, like basically where you are compared to the closest, what child you are of the closest ID. So if you're like 2 layers deep from an ID, I look at you're a div with this positional element, and I just go up the chain trying to basically make an ID for you. And what I'm doing is I'm taking a hash of the stuff. So I'm taking the value of the tag, the value of your child spot, and then keep going up and then creating a basically unique ID for you from that position. The thing is, I can do the exact same thing with the data-star attributes. I can just take the key and the value, hash those two things together, and now I know when something gets applied, has this already been applied? Because we already have these cleanup effects and stuff going on. So all I'm doing is just like putting the hash where I put it before. I was just putting like a dumb element, and I'm just saying, like, did we already look at this? Yes, and if we did, don't do it again. That's it. Like, it's such a simple change that it made me like think, why didn't I think of this like literally day one? There was no reason not to do this a long time ago. It's just surprising that you can leave something in for so long and be like, yeah, it's fine, and then yeah, it was like a 10-minute change, if not, just to go, oh, I can just replace everything, and it was easy. So this is more of a testament to, like, I'm not right. This is not a cult. Like, I was very wrong, and I wish someone would have looked at it and said, "Hey, idiot! Like, what are you doing?" Like, I
Well,
finally did that to myself
this
on
has
a long
been the
enough
theme
timeline.
for the entire beta. I feel like
Yeah,
every beta well, almost every beta
almost.
version,
It's
we've
Delaney doesn't know
we've
how to
been
code.
like, it's worked this well, it's this long, this well, and it would probably continue to work. But there, every now and then we find these kind of edge case bugs, and we're like, oh, that would probably be eased if we if we made this a little bit smarter. And it's just been a process of, like, even I think in beta 7, we still were doing this 2-phase pass on page load, and we were able to remove that. So we're just doing this one initial pass. And now, and the catch here is with what you just described, is that those hashes, they have to be unique, right? They have to be very descriptive of what it is that you're trying to track, because you want to make sure that nothing has changed. If something has changed, yes, reprocess it. But if we can create a hash that identifies a plugin or a Datastar attribute as already processed, there's no reason to process that ever again, which again, there isn't an obvious benefit to that besides we process less and there's less chance of us doing something twice, for example, or causing some sort of edge side effect. So do you want to talk about that hash algorithm? Because I looked at it, I saw some bitwise operations, I saw mention of this algorithm that I went off and read, and I think it was from back in the 90s. So I didn't get too much into it. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So for the people that like lower level stuff, hashing algorithms are always one of those things, because if you're looking up in a key inside of a map or something like that, you have to do a hash. Like obviously, a lot of things are called hash maps under the hood, right? So having a fast hash that doesn't cause a lot of collisions is hard to do. In our case, we don't care as much about the collisions because the chances of it happening within like local DOM nodes, it's a thing called the birthday paradox. So if you have something that's like I think ours is 32 bits, so the chances of having a collision are square root of 2 to the 32. So it's not, it's high, but it's not like I wouldn't put banking records in here, but for a DOM element to be correct, it's fine.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's safe enough. But the thing is, the one I ended up using is called DJB2, and the interesting part about it is it's one of the ones that's well known for being really well dispersed. Because part of the thing of a hash algorithm is like if you have a table, basically like a square of where the hash fits, like as a dot representation. Like let's say you have kind of like the X and Y, like you break it up into X, Y, just so it's easier to visualize. Lots of things like F and V is a pretty decent one. There's some of them that are really bad that basically make these banded areas or like splotches where you can there's going to be a lot of collisions because there's a lot of overlap between keys in an area. The DJB one is crazy fast. It's like a shift and an OR, and it's really really fast and it has a good distribution, and it's one of the few ones that's well known that there's like no mathematical basis. It's just like a programmer found it and said, well, this works. And like it's been there forever. Like F and V is probably a better one, but there's still more like rotations. Like there's things that you have to do. And like I was reading it again. I'm like, yep, we're gonna continue this tradition until someone complains about collisions. Like I want to do fast and go. One of the things I kind of wish is this is one of the things I actually hate about JavaScript is we're in a weird position where if you do bit shifting operators in JavaScript, it caps it to 32 bytes or bits, 32 bits, sorry. Which is dumb because you have 53 bits of mantissa to work with. Like you can have a 53-bit thing, but you can't, there's no way to say shift it, but use up all 53 bits that are valid for an integer. Like, so we could be more, I could do some stuff where I'm actually like shifting outside that register than doing a shift of that outside. Like I could do some things to make it actually be more collision efficient, but it's just one of those things. It's kind of an interesting one of like, it's good enough until someone tells me it's not good enough. So
wait, is that because I saw when I was reading the DJB2 algorithm that they do a multiply by 33? Is that why 33? Okay.
Yeah, well, no. The 33 is because it's a prime, or it's a non. It's weird because it's a non-prime. Basically, they had 32, but then plus one extra one, like so it ends up being times 33. Like it worked out. They basically did a brute force try of all these things and did like all these calculations. It's like 33 was the right number. Like they just like from just brute force working out the collisions and all that stuff. Like 33 was the right answer.
Okay.
So
there's two prime numbers multiplied by each other, and you get like this magic number that.
Yeah, it's definitely a magic number. And the funny thing is that it doesn't have a lot of math behind it. It's just like was a brute force approach that works and it's fast and it's like almost a lookup table. Like it's so fast. Like it's literally a shift and it's like 2 cycles, 2 micro ops, in fact, if I remember. So Yeah, no, it's more that like I thought it was kind of funny to put that in, but I think the thing that's more important than these kind of like little low level like, oh, that's cute. Like if we did FNV or some other one, like it would be fine. But really, what we're trying to do is we're trying to recreate or try to make it feel and act as if the state wasn't mutable. So we're talking about immutability, and the whole idea is a while back when React was new and was just a library and was great, like 0.6 days kind of thing. Um, the ClojureScript community put out some really interesting. David Nolan's kind of known in that space, and he came out with some really good benchmarks that showed that ClojureScript was faster than Ohm, which is their thing, their wrapper on top of React, was faster than React in its own demos. And the reason why is because they have persistent data structures and they have immutability built in. So they know if something's changed or not. So they were able to basically get should component update for free because they already paid that cost, basically. But the nice part about that is because they could basically eliminate whole sections of the tree, now all of a sudden they didn't have to do those compares on every render. So there's some really smart things that we're looking at doing. Even the stuff that I'm thinking about doing with Idiomorph, with Merkle trees and all that, it's literally about making things more immutable. Even if there's mutability underneath the hood, is about making it understood that the logic doesn't have to have all this mutable state. So every place we've been doing stuff, it's about trying to get rid of state and making things more functional yet still performant. Because it's easy with functional stuff to make a bunch of garbage to be collected, but yeah, we've been trying to avoid that. Like there's a line between those things. I think people kind of miss out. They think like, oh, I'm doing object oriented, or I'm doing functional, or I'm doing like, but it's really the like keeping these big blocks of immutability and then doing like mutable stack stuff inside your function, doing some smart stuff there, but keeping it immutable from the outside is just a better interface, I think.
Yeah, it seems like there's some parallels between Datastar and Idiomorph, even though Idiomorph is a dependency. But in terms of like walking the DOM and figuring out what has changed and when to reapply, and also since you've started having those conversations with Micah, and we'll see where he and maybe you take Idiomorph. But it sounds like immutability is a key aspect because you have much less to compare, because it's much easier to detect whether something has changed or not because you have an immutable structure there.
Yeah, and part of it is if this is where the whole does a version of Idiomorph or something like Idiomorph, its own morph, like a Datamorph or Datastar morph, make more sense is because we have different assumptions about what's going on at that moment, and we could actually apply things directly in that same walk. So instead of us doing a walk and Idiomorph doing a walk, and like you get a walk and you get a walk, like we can actually do it all in one pass. And the thing is that the way the callbacks and stuff work, I don't think that would work with Idiomorph today. Like it's built a little too generically to make that work. Whereas if I had more explicit control, we might be able to do that even faster. But again, no one's complaining about Datastar speed. In fact, Ryan Carnito was talking about Datastar on his weekly podcast. I ended up or his stream, and I ended up making a demo where he's talking about like what are we even testing anymore. Like he was seeing the DB and he was looking at this test and he was like, what are we even testing? I don't like, it's hard to say because if they can get stuff from the server back to here that fast, does that even count? Like they have a JS framework benchmark thing that is available that every front end framework uses. And I've thought about porting Datastar to it, but it doesn't really make sense because I can send 100,000 events in the same amount of time as 10 events. Like it almost doesn't matter for the way that Datastar works. So yeah, it was an interesting conversation that he was having, not with me, but with his audience. And I was trying to get involved and say, hey, like I would like to talk to you about this stuff, but he didn't care. But even in the simple
He did,
example,
just to point out, he did take
yeah.
notice. He did actually have the Datastar website and the DBMon example up on his screen, and he was seeing it. So I think it's, in some ways, Datastar just doesn't fall into the front end framework, when doing comparisons, because maybe it's not. Like we've called it a full stack framework. I've kind of referred to it as a conduit between the front end and back end. In many ways, you cannot compare these things because you're just comparing different things.
I mean, it would have been interesting if either Carson or I had the thoughtfulness about this back when React first came out, because there's almost nothing about this. I forget how old SSE is, but I think it's roughly in the same ballpark of when React came out. Um, I wonder if we would be having it would be a lot closer representation, because then it was just a rendering library. It was just like a VDOM diff thing. And that would have been an interesting conversation compared to like an idiomorph or something. But comparing the two now doesn't even make sense. Like I did a little Minesweeper demo just to see like roughly what we could do. And it was 5,000 nodes, DOM nodes, updating at 30 frames a second, and it was fine. And the issue was the browser, and we found out that there was a set timeout that was built into Datastar, that if we get rid of that, now it's closer to 8 to 10,000 nodes a second. Like these are just non-issues for real problems.
We're testing the bounds of the browser rather than the framework
100%.
at this point.
Yeah. No, it's definitely the browser in most cases, and it should be. Like that's a lot of people always like whenever you do 1,000,000 of anything, it takes some time, right? No matter what you're doing. When you do 10,000 DOM node updates a second, or per 1/30th of a second, like that adds up, right? The browser is doing a lot of work to make that happen. So, but again, that's such on the edges of what people are doing right now. I think this is a non-issue personally.
So, as I was trying to say, one of the things I love most about us leveraging hypermedia is that we have some of the smartest engineers in the world working on web browsers, and that means we don't have to be the smartest people in the world, right? Like, and I feel like some of these front-end frameworks, they demand very intelligent solutions because they're essentially trying to solve the same problem as the browser, whereas we're just leveraging the platform that is the browser and building on top of that.
Yeah, even things simple as like the ideas of what you can do in Signals. So there's a lot of research that's happening there because it matters when all your data is in Signals, right? Like they have people like Solid and Svelte, like they all have to think about Signals at a deep level because that's the thing that makes them different. So there's a new kid on the block in this that's a blend of reactively and preact signals, and like it's kind of a combination of ideas. It's almost like Tim sort if you're used to sorting algorithms, where like there's quick sort and there's merge sort, and Tim sort's kind of like I'll take this part of this part and this part like this part. So it's Tim sort's like a combination of multiple other sorts. Alien is kind of that with its logic. I ported it to Go, which helps me understand how it's really working. And there's a good chance that we'll probably change our thing out to Signals, even though it doesn't matter to us that much because literally like you should have 5 to 6 signals on the page. So this should be a rounding error, but it's just something that makes sense. But it's nice that we'll be able to leverage those things, but still not be part of any of the wars or anything. Like we don't care because it's a declarative thing. Like I can change out an entire semantics. Like the semantics of alien are completely different than the preact signals. But it doesn't matter because I have to do that thing. I expand the code and then there's a few bytes difference between the two implementations. I think that's really neat.
And do you see once signals become a native thing in browsers that we'll be able to leverage those too, and then we don't need a signals library? Or do you think?
Yeah, I think that it's completely deleted. And even the thing I did around namespace signals is about the only thing that'll stay. But a lot of that code is around the idea that you can't do certain things with signals the way they are now. But if the TC39 goes in, a lot of that goes away too. So if anything, my guess would be if signals became in the browser, we'd be at 12K, probably. So yeah,
and
it would
then
make a difference.
Move before becomes generally accepted, that comes out of the polyfills for that comes out of Idiomorph, that reduces things.
Well, and that now that I'm thinking about it, because like I said, it's 2K difference. But if you're talking about the core, because Datastar core is like 5.5 kilobytes, and it would be like 3.5 if you got rid of signals, right? Like that becomes pretty nice. Like that's a pretty big difference. That's like a 40% difference just right off the bat. So it again, these things don't matter that much because it's more about cacheability. But I do think that the less you compile on your page, the faster your first paint is. It's just one less thing to not think about anymore. Like I don't want to ever think about like my first page load ever again. Like that's just a non-issue in my head now, which is great. And we want to keep it that way.
Yeah. And leveraging browser APIs just makes sense long term because those are always going to be supported by browsers, right? Forever. Well,
yeah.
Forever.
No, I'm really excited to see what like Move Before is a really neat one. For those that don't know, it basically just means when you're changing out an element, if it shares the same ID and some of these same semantics, you can actually literally move it to a completely different part of the children's. Because normally what happens is a clone node happens, and then you can move the contents and reparent it somewhere else. So it's actually like a clone and delete situation. It's kind of like the Prestige, where it's just clones of him, and then he has to kill himself. Sorry, spoiler to a 20-year-old movie. But in this case, Idiomorph is actually able to use this new API called Move Before. Once that becomes in the browsers, that's a whole section that just goes away, and that's amazing. And I think that'll happen more and more over time. We've talked about that before. Like over time, I hope there's more stuff that just is built into the browsers. Like I think of Datastar as more of a polyfill. Like it's a polyfill to what like the backend needs to be able to put stuff on the browser. It really is HTML extended, but it's also HTML and JS extended because it's building in these reactivity things that aren't built in even to the JS layer.
Right. So even like Idiomorph, now it uses move before and contains a polyfill, and then we're using view transitions heavily. Well, not heavily, but we support them. And again, not fully supported just yet, but I've heard actually that Firefox, there is activity in the Firefox landscape around actually bringing that into the browser, which would be a long overdue thing, but I hope it comes. View transitions.
The one that I'm really excited about in the Move Before, because Move Before moves something on the same page, but I would love to see, because there's view transition basically says if this thing has the same view transition ID and you change to a completely different page, it'll basically morph that over into like it basically takes a screenshot and then takes a screenshot of and basically does a move of that element over, which is really neat. But I would love to see a Move Before that worked between pages, because then you could literally do the equivalent of HX Boost, but it's native in the browser and it doesn't feel janky. It's literally making it so if it has the same ID, has the same kind of thing, and then you put it over here, now they're literally the same node being updated between the two. That's, I think, the holy grail for that kind of stuff. Let's talk about event sourcing.
So I've been doing quite a bit of experimenting with event sourcing, and I have some ideas around how to leverage that for tracking state in the content management systems. And you have experience with this, and we've heard from the community that they would like to hear more about event sourcing, because I think one of the use cases for Datastar is that you can stream things down and you can use and leverage event sourcing. Go ahead.
Hold on. I just realized it's Tuesday.
Okay, so it got a bit darker in here. We just had a bit of a break. But let's come back to event sourcing, because it's come up often. And event sourcing is something that I think is a really powerful thing to understand and to be able to use. One of the challenges that I've found and that I've heard people discuss a lot is that there's just a lot of nomenclature. So there's just naming things is difficult, and event sourcing is kind of taking that difficulty to the next level. So some of the terms you come across in event sourcing, like events, commands, consumers, aggregates, decorators, repositories, dispatches, serializers, projectors, replays, like there's just tons of terms. And I feel like it's difficult to find your way through that kind of jungle of names for things, whereas it's really not that difficult. And I've experimented with different event sourcing libraries, and often I find like, okay, there's some ideas that are interesting here, there's some ideas that are interesting here, but really you can just do it yourself. Like you can do event sourcing without having to reach for one of these libraries or frameworks or go fully buy into these systems. So
I can give you some history about that, just because it might help give some clarity for people hitting this stuff. The weird thing about event sourcing and CQRS and all these ideas is that it actually got really popular in the object-oriented space. And like, there's like a 400 or 500 page book that was just Microsoft put out just about user stories about doing like event sourcing and doing a mock company and all this stuff. And it's funny because, like most things in the object-oriented space, man, they made it really complicated from day one. So like it is so over manager factory pattern impl factory manager singleton injection, right? Like there's a lot of that vibe that you get from it. So I want people to be aware that all these things are things that you would do, but they're so overloaded and they're so overhyped that it makes it actually hard to talk about the hard things, which, like, for example, sagas is a thing that is hard no matter what you do. And that's just a part of being a distributed system, but they make everything sound hard. So you don't know where the line is, if that makes sense.
yeah. One of the examples I reach for the most, and most people do, is your kind of bank account, because I think that's the perfect example, right? You log into your online banking and you see your current balance, but that current balance is a number that has been calculated based on a number of transactions that have taken place in the past. So while that number is very likely stored in a cache somewhere or maybe even a database, that is not your source of truth, that number, which represents the amount of money in your bank. It is what is the source of truth is all of the events that led up to that number, which is all of the transactions, which when you open your bank account, you'll see, right? You'll see all the transactions that took place in the last, let's say, 30 days. So those transactions in event sourcing terminology, those are your events. Those are your source of truth, and you can replay those events. And your current bank account balance is simply a projection of all of those events. And you can replay those. If you replay those, you could recalculate that number at any time. Another, I don't know if this is a one-to-one to event sourcing, but version controls. Every time you make a commit to GitHub, GitHub is tracking what changed in your code base, and therefore it builds up the current state over time. Now, I don't know if GitHub actually just records the changes or if it records the entire
No,
state every
this
time.
actually is a perfect segue. That's a great point. So there's the whole thing about event sourcing that I think is the most important part that people, that's the only thing you need to take away from it is anytime you have a delete or an update in your data source of truth, whether that's a database or whatever, if you have a delete or an update, you are losing data. And that is like the most important thing to keep in mind. And the most canonical example is someone puts something into a shopping cart and they take it back out. Like if that's an update in your in a row in your table, you just lost a bunch of information for your sales team. They're like, "Hey, did it come back? Did they put it back in because of a sale? Did they put it in because it's at the end of the month because of a check?" There's all these reasons that are there. So as soon as you start doing updates and deletes of your actual source of truth, you're in a bad place. And the way that you go about that doesn't matter as much.
And that's because all you see, or the only current state that you're holding on to, is how many products do they have in their basket. You have no idea of like what actually led up to that current state.
Well, and the analogy that I think does this really well, David Nolan from he's the author of Closure Script. He has a really interesting talk where he's talking about Go compared to chess. And chess is a subtractive game because you start with a full page or a full thing of pieces, and over time you're basically subtracting the game. The game gets simpler as the game goes on because there's only so many moves that can happen, with a reduced set. Whereas the game Go, you're always adding, you're always accreting information to the board. It never goes away. It's basically called the game of life because it literally is just an accretion of state. Go is kind of a hard one because you don't know the exact moves that got you into that state, but you still see all the state of where you're at. So it's closer to an event sourcing system than chess. Chess is like, that's why you need all the extra notation and stuff in chess. Um, so yeah, it's something to be just aware of. And the reason why I wanted to stop you when you started talking about Git. So a lot of the times when you say, "Hey, I have an event and I'm going to patch, basically keep the diffs of things, so I can take the diffs and then recreate state." That's more of a like optimization algorithm because there's some people are like, "Well, I want to keep the diffs and then I don't want to read 100,000 events. I want to keep a snapshot and then pull from those events." Okay, so that's now you made it a little more complicated. Git is the ultimate version of like YOLO. We don't need to do this. And what they do is every single change you make, even if it's a like a one character change, last I checked, it saves the entire file. It just copies the entire file, the new file. And what they rely on is they rely on the underlying compression of like gzip, or I forget what they're using right now, to basically take care of that diff for them. So it's just a YOLO thing of like they keep an entire copy of the thing. There's a lot of times with Nats where I will keep like if I'm doing an event sourcing type thing, I can keep history on keys. The key value store in Nats has a history, so you can actually keep multiple revisions of things. But the nice part is underneath at the block level, we do S2 compression. So we actually have compression built in, which means that you can basically do these giant copies, and it's not that expensive. And if we've learned anything, diffing large, textual sets like with HTML and stuff, it's not that bad. It's like it actually compresses pretty well. So it's more that's why I don't go. People are like, "Hey, what solution? Like, what framework are you using for your event sourcing?" And like, that's like saying, "What framework are you using for your B tree?" Like, it's an algorithm. Like, if it makes sense for your usage, like you should use it. But there's always a cost for these things, and the cost is you have to you have to basically be of two wolves. There's always the two wolves analogy. There needs to be either you need to really understand your domain, and you can have like a protobuf that's a defined protocol binary level thing that you can. The nice part about protobufs is they actually are versions, so you can add more information, and you can take old data and basically putting it into the new without making changes. So either you go that route of being like a binary, well established contract, or you need to do the other thing of like, we basically accept anything. Like, you basically accept like pure JSON or Eden or any of these other kinds of formats, and you say, we'll take anything, and then it'll be up to us to try to consolidate this stuff together. So the thing is, it really comes down to don't throw away data. And if you can do it in a binary format, like for example, bank accounts are a pretty well known thing. Accounting is a well established thing that's a few thousand years old. You probably know what the events are for a bank account. You may not know what they are for your new startup. So it's something to just be aware of, is that flexibility and performance are usually it's a balancing act. If you want to be super performant, the lower level in the binary protocols are going to be faster, but you're not as flexible. So
Right. So ultimately, it comes down to leaving an audit trail that you can always reference back to, whether it be in accounting, in banking, in version control, etc.
well, and the thing is that people, this is sometimes Martin Klepton talks about the inversion of the database. And what that means is that basically a lot of people treat, whether it's Postgres or SQLite or MySQL or whatever, they treat that as their source of truth. And then they can basically write out logs to see what's happening like in the system, like for a trail. Whereas the way that if you're thinking event sourcing, you're flipping that, you're inverting that. So you think about the logs first about what happened, and then you can propagate and make projections and make these perfect indexes that are queries about what happened. So those are different concepts.
Yeah, and I think that that's maybe a misconception as well about event sourcing, that to find any state, you have to replay the entire course of the events. And that's why we have snapshots or projections or aggregates or whatever you want to call them. Just like your bank account, you very likely a statement is generated every month or something. So there's the kind of snapshot of every month, or at the end of the month, your balance is stored.
Well, and this is one of those things where nomenclature does matter, is that in general, when you're talking about snapshots, you're talking about the aggregate snapshots that are the actual right side of your like CQRS thing. Like that's where the right side happens, so that you're not like, it's the actual state that your events accrete into. Like they basically turn into an aggregate. Like you fold that state and this is your object. You can take a snapshot of that. The thing is, projections, what you're talking about are projections, and projections are different because you can completely delete a projection. You completely make it go away. Like the general case is, let's say you're making a SQLite database and you're reading from the event log and you're saying, hey, I only care about messages that start with foo and have more than 10 items in it. Like that's all that are of this type of message. Great. So you go and pull that data down, and now you have you literally can make a table that has a perfect index of exactly the things that you care about. So now you have a super fast lookup, and your quote snapshot, basically you say, I'm going to grab 10,000 events at once. I'm going to do one transaction. Now I'm in this new state. And part of that state is also writing to the database what was the last event you saw. So even if you die and come back, you'll start at that 10,000th or 100,000th event and keep going. So you'll actually be able to. So snapshots from a projection standpoint are just like, that's what a projection is basically an indexed snapshot of the last event you saw. Whereas when you hear snapshot, usually it has to deal with the actual right side of writing to seeing if event is valid to write into the log. Because once you write into the log, you can't ever get rid of it.
Okay, so snapshots are things that aggregate a bunch of events and like a freeze frame of the current state of things.
Yeah, of the current state, the actual like logical state, whereas that's different than a projector. Those are two different
Okay.
things.
So
So, for
what is the
example,
distinction there?
let's say that there's a tree in your front yard, right? And it has stats about it. It has like how much it weighs, how big it is, how old it is, what how many bugs are inside of it, like literally all the actual state about the tree. That's really important stuff. The thing is that when you go and add a new thing of saying, hey, we just added a new branch literally in the tree, like a new bud came out, that's state that you have to basically load all the state of what happened to the tree in the past and say, okay, this bud is valid. It can't be a bud that's off in space, right? Like there's certain validations that have to happen. If you see a bud off in space, it probably doesn't, it's not a valid bud for this tree. So there's these things that you check for of the state of the tree. And if it's a valid request of like add bud here, then you add it to the log and then you go about your day. So that's what the snapshot part is that you could load the current state of that tree, like all the data about that tree. And the command that comes in, which is we were talking about like a couple of times ago about CQRS, is the command is like, I want to add a new event. Is that allowed? Is that something that's okay with the state as it is? The projection side is a completely different concept. That's basically saying, hey, an HOA wants to know how many trees you have in your front yard because you have to have at least 2 trees that are of this size or whatever. So all it's going to have in its database is tree. There is one tree, and it just oak tree. It doesn't care about any other stuff. They just need to know about oak tree. So its idea of snapshot is there are 2 trees in his front yard. That's all we care about. Like there's nothing else in the data. So when you talk about snapshot for them, that doesn't really make sense. It's not really the tree anymore. It's this projection of a tree. It's what they care about. Where if the gardener might care that if a tree is older than this amount of time, I need to put it on this schedule or put it on this less amount of this time. I need to change the schedule. So their idea of what is valuable about the tree's age even is different than the HOA's thing. Like if they're saying you have to keep a landscape that's older than this, like all these are different ideas of the HOA and the landscaper have different ideas of what snapshot isn't really what it is to them. It's just like what their current projection is. Whereas snapshot, when you're talking about, when you're ever reading this literature, you're talking about the actual tree data itself, like what constitutes that aggregate, which is the tree in this case.
Yes. Okay. That is starting to make sense. I guess I would summarize that as projections can be made, can be different depending on the target. So the same data can be used and projected in different ways depending on the person or the entity that is trying to interpret that data.
Yeah, and it can even go a little bit further. Like, for example, let's say you're doing A/B testing of a UI, and you're like, hey, we want to try this whole new way of looking at the data. You can turn that on and off at a load balancer of like looking at these 2 different projections. And the one projection doesn't just magically die. It's still there and it's staying up to date. And now you have this new one. And now you can switch between them depending on what you're like on a load balancer saying, hey, we're going to get 40% of traffic here. We're going to get new people to try this new way. So it opens up a whole bunch of ideas. And also the nice part is that scales so much better because A, the projections are perfect indexes into what the question is. And B, you can scale that wide as you want. You can shard that easily. So most of the time with this stuff, you're going to have a single writer per stream, like per aggregate type, or there's a couple different ways to do it. But generally, it's a single writer, multi-reader. That is just part of computer science, that everything comes down to single writer, multi-reader for most problems, like that have to do with scale.
Why do you think Datastar is well suited to event sourcing?
Yeah, I guess it's because that's the way that I think about problems. And the whole impetus of Datastar was like, I want to show things in real time. I want to show these projectors as they update, having a direct hook in to be push-based. So the nice part about projections is that once you get this event log, you can do things in batches, but you have known new good state. Like you have a perfect state, like ready to go. So if someone's already asking you a question, you know the answer and you knew what the previous state was, like you can answer that thing immediately. So instead of polling, instead of doing all these crazy lookups or like rebuilding things and having to rebuild indexes and do all kinds of crazy stuff to try to take everyone's idea of what state is and put them together, you can just hook them right up. There's been a lot of projects I worked on where I basically made either a completely separate database or just at the very least a separate table for every single question in the front end. So it's like the perfect version of what GraphQL wishes it could be, because I can know exactly the UI and exactly the questions it's asking and what it's allowed to see. So Datastar is great because you don't have the security issues of GraphQL because there is nothing for them to get access to, but you have the ability to have hundreds of thousands of requests a second into the millions of requests because you can shard that out between the different things people are asking about. So it just flows so easily. And the irony is it's way easier than GraphQL, and it's way less work than any of these things. In fact, a while ago, there was someone said, "Hey, this Theo guy is making 5 versions of the same app in one framework," and they made a video of it. And I did the Go version, and it was less code, and it's like an order of magnitude less memory, and it's faster, and it just works. And it's just doing the kind of the CQRS kind of style thing, and it just works. And it's using SQL Lite, and it generated queries and all that, and it's easy. It was easier, and
And
it's less code.
that was using Go with Datastar and instead of GraphQL, just CQRS.
Yeah, because the thing is that they made it. They're like, the Go way is hard and it's complicated and all that. It was like, well, yeah, because you guys made it complicated. Like, you made it hard. You don't need GraphQL or any of these other steps. You just take the stuff that you're pulling in and like serve it in HTML. Like, that's it. Like, it was less code than their T3 example, and it was like so much faster. And it was only like 13 megabytes. Like, it's like 6 times smaller than a Hello World in Node. Like, I don't know.
Is there a data store that you think is particularly well suited to event sourcing, or perhaps not well suited?
I think that there's the one thing that's really interesting to me about there's 2 things that I keep going back to, or 3 really. I think SQLite, especially the pure Go version that I use, is just so wonderful because it allows you to think in terms of your actual queries instead of trying to fight the client server disconnect. And what I mean by that is, you could, like, in normal SQL setups, you have to be really clever about reducing the amount of round trips. Whereas with SQLite, because it's in the same process, you can do n+1 queries, like hundreds of queries on a single page, and it's a non-issue. Like, it's just a non-issue. So there's a lot going there that it's really neat. The other one that I think is interesting, depending on your problem, if you have something that's more read heavy and you like columnar stores, DuckDB is really interesting. There's not a really good story for that in Go, so I don't use it as much. And especially the stuff I do, I found it to be 2 or 3 times slower. But for certain kinds of analytical queries like sales and marketing type stuff, man, DuckDB is where it's at when it comes to columnar stores. And then the other one is, honestly, I use Nats for so many things, just because the key value and the push semantics like are so great. The fact that you don't have to, like, Pocket Base is an example of a project that uses SQLite and Go. And what they have to do is, basically, every time someone does an insert, they have a little callback that says, if you're doing a subscription on an insert on this table, on this ID, or on this table, go send off an event. Whereas with the key value semantics and the object store and all the stuff that you have in Nats, I just don't have to worry about that. I can just basically get the equivalent of a channel that's agnostic to programming language, and I can just listen to that thing and get updates immediately. So, like, to me, Nats is the perfect version of that. But it doesn't do all the querying and stuff. Like, there's a reason why Nats is so much faster than these other things, is that you don't have these crazy level, like, SQLite has a built-in fuzzy text search. It has built-in JSON indexing semantics. It has, like, all kinds of R trees are an amazing thing for doing spatial queries. Like, there's stuff that's built in that's just amazing. So I think for me, the combination of Nats and SQLite, I put that into every single project that I do. Like, no matter what, the first thing I do is I open up Go and I embed Nats and I like embed SQLite, and that's like where I start. Like, I use the same setup basically for any problem, and that's a really good way to do it. The other way, also, I just want to make sure that people are aware that, like, this is kind of like the Go more procedural way, but there's also other options out there for doing event sourcing type things. There's a database called XTDB and Datomic in the Clojure and JVM space. And the way they do it is they have these persistent stores and these immutable data structures where you just save your state, and it automatically, like, goes back and does all the persistent data history and stuff for you. So it just looks like you're updating state of this object, and the rest is handled for you in the background. We can get into all the details of how that works. It's a really interesting space, but the point is that there is no one solution. Like, there's some solutions that can be faster or better, more performant in certain situations, but they also can be less flexible. So just, if nothing else, realize if you aren't doing event sourcing, you're losing data, but a lot of times that's okay. It just depends on your situation. Most situations I work in, that is a non-acceptable thing to just throw things on the ground. So it just depends on what workspace you're in.
Makes sense. Yeah. Cool. Anything else about event sourcing that you think is important to say? I think the Bi-temporal example is really interesting. If you could touch on that.
Sure. So one of the things that you get kind of as a magic thing, and this is where like the business side would fall in love with you if you aren't doing event sourcing and you start pulling it off. Like if you can actually pull it off and it works for your system, this is where it becomes a magic case. So you can talk to the business. And normally when it comes to business things, they say, hey, I have this new thing where like we want to do a sale and we want to do 5% off people that have done more than 10 orders in the last 30 days. And you'd write that up and you're like, okay, I have that query to go. Like we're ready to go. Like we'll be able to add that to coupon or whatever. And you're done. And you're like, okay, going forward, we're ready to go. Well, if you're doing event sourcing correctly, you can say, not only do I want to know that that coupon's ready, I can say it would have affected this many people over the last sliding window since the beginning of time kind of thing of like, hey, I can actually show you how this would apply to everybody else and what kind of reach they've had before in the past. So like that 5% applied to these things and later they made, you know, X amount of purchases. Well, we can now use that as a base metric for the sale going forward. It's saying, did it actually have the impact we thought it would? So, like, was it just noise or was it something? So, there's all these kinds of interesting things that marketing and business will fall in love with you with. Like, that's the reason why you have these kinds of things.
So it sounds like you can go back in time to a point in time and you can change some parameters, replay the events with those parameters, and then predict an alternative present based on had we done it this way. And perhaps you could project that into the future if you wanted to. But the ability to replay those events with tweaked parameters sounds like, yeah, for marketers, it would be an amazing tool to have.
Yeah, no, it's really important. Even things like when it comes to auditability, the fact that you have a audit trail of everything that's going on, and you're like, hey, we got bad data in the system. Like this, there is a leak of PIAA, which is like personal information, which in a military sense, like you can't leak PIA. Well, there might be a situation where you do, and now you have data in the database. You can actually go have a corrective version of it, replay all the events, have now that corrective thing, and basically change the DNS record to that be your new database of record, and basically recreate history and get rid of that leak that happened. Like there's all these kinds of
Oh,
interesting ideas
that's
that you can have.
so like forking off of the event source at a specific point in time to correct an event that should never have happened.
Yeah. So the thing that's
Rewriting
interesting,
history, in other words.
I mean, the thing is that what is history other than like a fork? I mean, that's the same thing with Git, right? Like what is main other than like what's on GitHub? Like I'm main, you're main, we're all main. Like it's all depends on like where the thing is that it comes down to a human issue. Like what is the official version is a human issue, and you can never solve technical problems with human like like you can never solve human issues with technical solutions in my so yes, that is rewriting history, but you're still preserving the old history until you're like told legally you can't, which is again a human issue, not a technical one.
Right. And the reason that's important is because you don't go back and you don't change events. Like you don't go back in your commit history and change a commit. It's something that you either revert in the future or you change the state back, or you take an earlier fork and you take a different branch, and then that
Yeah, I mean,
off branch becomes your main branch.
and to be clear, like when you get a hash from like that is a blockchain. Like it is a set of chains that are connected together with hashes and stuff. You can build the same thing. So I think a lot of the ideas from the Web3 world of like the underlying math of what they were trying to do makes a lot of sense. I don't think that the idea of not trusting each other about your blocks and stuff is ever was going to work out. Like that was my issue with the Satoshi stuff at the beginning. But using these same ideas for your own personal, basically blockchain, your own auditable thing, there's huge value in that, and the cost is very low to do a hash, especially like if you do like the XXH3 and some of the other hashes. Even SHA-256 is pretty fast. Blake 3, if you're into that kind of thing, is fast too. Like there's some options here to be fast, not pay a high cost, and now have this information forever. So I think there's real value there.
Cool. I think we covered it all, or what we wanted to cover at least. We got a bit technical, but there's so much more to explore, and I think Datastar really facilitates that type of exploration, which is great for people who like to do backend stuff.
Yeah, I still love that the most of the time, unless it's someone that's brand new that's asking questions of like, how do I paginate, which is like just a backend issue. Most of the time, it's talking about like deep thoughts on like what a backend needs to handle. Like, where do I keep state? How do I like think about these things? It has almost nothing to do with Datastar, and it's just going to become more of that over time. And I love it. Like the Discord's been great with that because you get to see where people's heads are at. And you also get to see certain people's journey of like coming from like, why can't I do this? Like, how do I do this? Why am I doing this? To like, oh, it's not that bad. Like there's a little path that people take, which is kind of fun to see where on the path they start and where they end up. So far, we've only had like one or two people that are like, this is just not for me. Like I just want my spa back. And that's fine. Like, but I guess the thing is, it's not made for them anyway. If you're happy in a spa, why are you using Datastar? Like, why are you doing hypermedia?
Yeah, no, I think that I don't know if it's the majority, but a big portion of people come in and try things out and then leave. They don't leave. Hopefully they stay, but they find themselves saying, wow, I couldn't imagine I could have done this with so little work. That's something a theme that repeats over and over again.
Yeah. And the
Well,
good news is that like, it's getting boring now. Like I don't even know what we're going to have to talk about next time. Cause like, we're kind of there.
yeah. Well, we'll see.
Yeah.
That's what we've been thinking. That's what we've been saying the last couple of beta versions. So there is more. We can. We might even have more guests on to talk about different kind of ancillary things that are interesting. But otherwise, we'll just see how it goes and keep plowing on until we release that V1 stable sweetness.
Yeah. And then sit back and drink Mai Tais or whatever. Sangrias. Sangria is better than Mai Tai. I'll take a sangria any day.
All right. Catch you next time.
All right. See you guys.